Hi everyone, my name is Julia Madison and I will be the technical manager for this session on making better figures, visualizing data for action, shared by our friends at the DataDent team. So thank you all so much for taking part in ANH 2022. We look forward to a really robust and interactive session today. A quick reminder that everything you might need to access conference materials and the program can be found at the ANH Academy website at anh-academy.org/ANH2022. So before Trisha takes the conversation forward, I just have a few technical announcements to ensure our experience is as smooth and interactive as possible. So first, this session is being recorded and will be posted on the ANH Academy website following the conference. Second, all participants have been muted, but please take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat function. Let us know your name, where you're joining us from, and the organization that you work with. We encourage you to share your webcam feed during this session, but if your connection is bad, then we recommend turning your video off. Later in the session, we will open up the conversation for Q&A, but if you have any questions throughout the session, please put them in the chat box and we will do our best to answer them. And last, if you experience any technical issues, please check your audio settings and your internet connection. You can always try to reconnect to the session using the same Zoom link you used to join now. So if you have any technical questions, please send me a private message using the chat box. So thank you so much again, everyone, for joining, and I'm going to pass it over to Trisha.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to join you today. My name is Trisha Aung. I'm a research associate as part of DataDent, which is led by 3 organizations. I'm affiliated with Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I'm also a PhD student at University of Washington in the Department of Human-Centered Design and Engineering. And I'm really excited to share with you today a training that I've developed and it's kind of evolved over the past 5 years. If you attended our session last year, it'll be very similar. There are some new things that we wanted to incorporate based on some stuff that we've been working on this past year, but I just want to give a full disclosure that it is quite similar, but there are some exciting new changes. So first, to just get started on how I've structured the next 2 hours, it's going to be primarily didactic and interactive. There are exercises interjected. We will use breakout rooms. And so I hope that everyone will find this a useful exercise. So just to kick off, what is data visualization? Data visualization is the process of graphically displaying data to tell a story. Why is it important? Well, we know from human cognition and perception research that our brains process visuals quicker than seeing text. And so that suggests that graphs can be potentially more persuasive than seeing a table. As a result, data visualization is a pretty compelling advocacy and communication tool, potentially. And I say potentially because, as you all might know, data visualization can go wrong. And if it does go wrong, it can have the opposite effect of either being misleading or just confusing an audience to a point where they can't take action. And so we'll talk about that a little bit today. The basis of this training and how we make decisions on how to visualize certain data will be based on what you want to communicate. And we've outlined 3 different buckets and steps of considerations to think about before you embark on the decision of how do I visualize my data. Another note that I wanted to comment on data visualization is that data visualization is primarily led by usually in academia in the departments of engineering or computer science and psychology. And there are very different outlooks of data visualization. So for our sake today, data visualization that we will focus on is on simple graphs that everyone can make with the tools available to them. And so by tools available to them, I mean Excel, Tableau Public, so free tools that are non-interactive, that don't require high-speed internet and can be printed or can be used in electronic communications. Other dimensions of data visualization that can be considered are how to create new novel ways of visualizing data. And that route is a little less of interest just to us at DataDent, because what we've found is policymakers yes, I'm only on the first title presentation slide. Policymakers and decision makers that we've worked with don't really necessarily want to see extremely interactive visualizations that require high data literacy or can't kind of bridge that gap between being purely virtual, so requiring high-speed internet, being very interactive, and can't be necessarily printed. So as an introduction, I went over just a general how we're going to define data visualization today. Our focus is really on the sense-making aspect. And on the left is a picture that really is shown usually in the first day of any epidemiology class. It's the picture of John Snow when he was mapping out cholera outbreaks, and it's one of the most well-known public health images. And the premise of this, of showing this map to young budding epidemiologists is, well, he solved this epidemiology conundrum because he mapped everything out. And so from a data visualization angle, this had a very huge force in trying to figure out the location of this outbreak. Ironically, later, there were historians who figured out that actually they figured out where the cholera was coming from without the map, which is something that isn't really mentioned as much. But for this sake, it's an illustrative use of data visualization to solve a problem or to communicate findings. On the right side is a picture from the Global Burden of Disease, one of their earlier visualizations, and it's a comparison. There's two different pie charts, and I'm sure you all have seen pie charts like this, where there are many, many, many slices, and one has to identify what is that slice of pie that I'm looking, or slice of cheese. So we will discuss what are alternatives to something like that. Two definitions that I want to give you today are data visualization literacy, which we've defined as, being able to construct data visualizations and then being able to read the data visualization, interpret, extract, make sense from that data visualization. In comparison to data literacy, which is the ability to use that data to answer a question. So less so focused on data visualization if you're curious on the difference. So in terms of today's session goals, we'll learn how to choose the most appropriate data visualization based on your communication goals or key messages, and then what makes a good or a bad data visualization. This is a mapping of how I got involved in data visualization and how the origins of the data visualization work. So in 2016, Rebecca Heidkamp and I were working on the National Evaluation Platform. Rebecca Heidkamp was the lead in that project on the NEP, similar to DataDent. And we had an external evaluator. The purpose of the NEP was essentially to create these help desks within 4 sub-Saharan African countries where maternal, newborn, child health, and nutrition policymakers, senior level policymakers could go to this help desk and present priority policy questions that they want answered. We would work more closely with the mid-level, junior level Ministry of Health professionals and also National Statistic Office professionals to answer those questions. So identify the relevant data, go through the analysis to answer those questions, and then go through dissemination. We had an external evaluator come in and they said, you do really great work, but we really don't have evidence of influencing policy, which is a very much something that comes up, I think, in a lot of these types of development projects, and where there is kind of an expectation of, I think there is a lot of an assumption is that if the evidence is compelling enough, then people will be motivated to change. But we know from even in the US that this is not what happens. There are a lot of factors that go involved in that. So after this external evaluation, we decided to incorporate more strategic communication training. Also because during our workshops and during the preparation of our analytical findings, there seemed to be a gap in being able to present those findings in a way where policymakers in those countries would be prompted for action. So I created this data visualization curriculum, and what you will see today is actually the many, many iterations from that. So that was first launched in 2017. We did data visualization workshops for all 4 of the NEP countries. We did a specialized data visualization study in Tanzania. where we looked at preferences and literacy data visualization literacy within Ministry of Health professionals in Tanzania to help inform how we are going to present our final our findings. And then we've also, kind of extended this work within DataDent to think of it more, to think of data visualization more as a tool within the agriculture, nutrition, health space. And so we've done, DataDent broadly has done a lot of work led by R4D on data visualization monitoring tools. So these might be things like dashboards or scorecards, and kind of a semblance of, what does that landscape look like? Spoiler alert, there are a lot of those types of tools. And all of them have kind of a different, level of efficacy and use by individuals. We have done another data visualization study in Nigeria, which has wrapped up. And so there is now a final brief for that type of work. And that was focused on figuring out data visualization, literacy, and preferences. And that was an online survey supplemented by some in-depth interviews. And that those results will be disseminated hopefully soon at the next Nigeria Nutrition Data event. So for the first exercise, I'm going to show you 2 examples and 1 key message. This exercise is something that we did as part of the original Tanzania data visualization study we did with NEP. This format is something that we've also done as part of the Nigeria nutrition data visualization study as well. So here's the key message. In 1 in 4 countries have data that show that they are on track to reach WHO targets for child malnutrition. However, we lack data to assess progress in 1/4 of countries. So that's our key message. And here are 2 different examples. So it's the same data set, but visualized 2 different ways. We're going to put up a Zoom poll, and I want you to vote on which one you think, so either 1 or 2, best resonates with the key message that's displayed. So it looks like things are generally split with slightly more people who are choosing the second option. Says, do we have any brave participants who are with us today who want to give the case, to push a case for either 1 or 2?
I think with the second one, it's much easier to compare the exact quantities of every different color because they're right next to each other and you have those vertical lines going down. So I find it easier to compare, say, the number of pale green for stunting, wasting, and overweight versus on the first one. I can't compare them.
Thanks, Emma. Heather says option 2 is easier to see the difference between indicators. Marike, option 1 because values add to 100%. I also want to point out the additional comment if I'm on my phone, so it's hard to see, and something that it's something to consider also when thinking about data visualization and the type of format that you choose and how people will consume it. So it's something that we'll also keep in mind with our decision. So we're going to move to the next example. So I have a second example that's very similar, but a different key message and different data set. So key message number 2, the exercise number 2, gender inequalities exist among men and women in ownership and or tenure rights for agricultural land. In some countries with data available, there is a reduction in this inequality gap over time. So here are, similar to the last example, there's 2 ways of visualizing this data and 1 key message. So just like before, I'd appreciate if you could vote either 1 or 2 based on the key message. So it looks like similar to the last example, people are split 50-50. So on the left side, and we'll go through what the implications of these types of graphs and whatnot. The graph on the left is called a dumbbell plot. It's a version of a dot plot. The option on the right is a bar graph. It's just a regular histogram. Again, are there any brave individuals who would like to make the case for 1 or 2?
For me, it was for the number 1 because I thought to have the 2 dots linked, you can see the gap more clearly. It felt for me you can compare the difference quite straight away. I think it's harder for the over time, but if you do follow because they're together, so for example, you have Nigeria 2016, Nigeria 2019, it feels, because it's just 1 line that we have to use, it feels kind of easier to be like, okay, well, there is clearly a difference rather than the gap that for me was harder to compare.
Great, thanks for sharing. And everyone, please do read the other what's going on in the chat, where other people are providing more of their insights on why they choose what. One thing that I want to encourage you to move towards is we are visualizing based on key message. And so we want to choose a visualization both based on this key message and what we want to come across, and also what practically it has to look like eventually, depending on the dissemination material. So just as a background, and we will revisit these examples and we'll do a poll again to see how it's shifted, how people's preferences have shifted. But one story I do want to share while we proceed, I already had that, was when we decided to do the Tanzania study, when we worked with the National Bureau of Statistics, and the response was, why should we even do the study? Because everyone's always going to choose a bar graph. And our response was like, well, if everyone chooses a bar graph, we want to have that empirical evidence, so we know what to focus on when it comes to our dissemination. And so there are some data visualization experts that really much push for a certain aesthetic vision of, oh, you should never use a pie chart or things like that. But what I want to get across to you is it's really dependent and should be dependent on contextual preferences, and also how do we optimize what we use so it's legible. So maybe you will be using a boring bar chart, but I think for us, our intention is really communication. It's not necessarily coming up with something splashy. It's coming up with something memorable that someone can understand and take action. So I previously had volunteered with a group called the Data Visualization Society, which is it's an organization of individuals that are interested or work in data visualization adjacent type fields. And I led this discussion. And what do people think about when they visualize data for audiences that might have variable data literacy, or audiences that are in low middle income countries? And one thing that came out of it was someone said the graphic is only as useful as the audience finds it. And so this kind of resonates with this idea that I was conveying about how we do want to prioritize what is something that someone can understand, but also even thinking about infrastructure wise, something that someone can see. So in the chat right now, I saw some individuals bring up the colors. So thinking about if you're projecting your data visualization as part of a presentation in a setting, in a conference room or whatnot, with a projector that might have variable quality or variable visual acuity once it's projected, you want to think about what colors or what types of data visualizations would actually show up on the projector screen, rather than kind of being adherent on using a certain type of graph. And another dimension of that is if you choose a type of data visualization that might be really beautiful, but someone can't really understand it, then it's kind of a lost cause because you aren't really getting to a point where you can communicate to someone. So this is actually a new portion of the training that we added since last year. As part of DataDent, and Rebecca Heitkamp and myself, we worked on this UNICEF technical note on how do you select appropriate data visualization. So we outlined 3 different buckets of things to keep in mind. So the first is communication goals and key messages. The second is your target audience. And the third is the type of output. And kind of to provide more illustration on why this matters. And today we'll spend more time thinking about the communication goals and selecting a data visualization based on those communication goals, but these are other factors that you want to keep in mind. So asking yourself, what do you want the audience to remember from this data? So if there is one key takeaway, and if you think about, people have a very low capacity to remember many facts. And so you want to be very selective of, like, okay, well, if I know that my audience can only remember 1 or 2 facts, what are things that I really want them to remember? Because ultimately how you answer that question will influence what type of data visualization you choose. Why that's important is there are certain, and as I mentioned, certain ways of visualizing data are more effective at different types of key messages. So I'll go into this more later, but in the examples that we saw, the key message mentioned an equity gap. And because the equity gap is something we want to convey, it's something we want to keep in mind when we're trying to decide on a data visualization choice. In terms of target audience, who are you trying to reach? And how familiar are they with the data and kind of the concepts and communication goals that you have in mind? Realistically, a lot of decision makers who are in LMICs might not necessarily have an agriculture, nutrition, or health background. They might be career politicians. And so thinking about what do you have to supplement your data visualization to help with facilitate that knowledge transfer and sense making is something to keep in mind. Also, another thing to keep in mind related to that is some individuals are very uncomfortable with seeing anything that isn't a bar chart or a pie chart or a line graph. So it's especially something that you want to think about in terms of your final dissemination materials. If you include a different type of data visualization type, are you going to provide enough supporting annotations so that someone who is kind of resistant of seeing anything that isn't a bar chart is willing to engage with that data? And then finally, in terms of type of output, where do you intend your data visualization to be disseminated? Is it, over a mobile phone? Is it on print? Or is it over, a projector? And why this matters is, the print quality can really influence how your visuals show up. Particularly, I've been in cases where the print quality can be quite variable. And so that also influences what types of colors you are selecting. In some cases, you are kind of beholden to those colors because they are country colors or organization colors, but it's also always a possibility to incorporate different visual cues to be able to take that into account. Also, as I mentioned, interactive data visualizations or interactive dashboards might not make sense if someone doesn't have internet connectivity all the time or might not have a working laptop. So it's all these different infrastructure factors are things that you want to keep in mind when trying to decide what type of data visualization might make the most sense. So what is a key message? Again, it's something you want someone to remember. And then you're going to choose a data visualization type based on your key message. So here I have a graph that's from the JME report from last year. And so I'm just showing you this blankly. And I'm curious, what do you think is the key message that the authors are trying to get across? Feel free to share this in the Zoom chat. So just based on this graph and what you see, and you're the audience, what do you think they're trying to get across?
I think it says stunting is going down.
So there's some great suggestions on how people are interpreting this different figure. And you'll notice some changes based on how people are interpreting it within the chat. Some people are picking out actual number of children that are affected. Some are mentioning regions or specifically stunting prevalence in different regions. So there's an aspect of trend, there's an aspect of geographic location. What I'm going to show you is basically you can whittle down key messages on very simple categories. So there's comparisons where you want to say these two numbers are either the same or different, how one number is related to a total, how numbers change over time. So those are all comparisons. And then another bucket would be small numbers, percentages, or frequencies that you want to highlight. So this would be one number that you really want someone to remember. If we were thinking about the context of key messages in these very general categories, going back at this example, so the top, the number of children with stunting is declining in all regions except Africa. This was the UNICEF WHO teams, that was their key message. And so, it's interesting if you reflect on what they were trying to get across and compare it with what you came out of that graph with. And then thinking about how you would categorize that into messages, it's both a comparison of how things are changing over time, so the decline, and then also the proportion of how one number compares to a total. Also interesting, and one thing I want to point out within their key message is it's mentioning, you know, number of children with stunting declining in all regions except Africa. And so there is one exception to this case, but there is a lot of information in this graph. And I think it's a really, you know, it's a very aesthetically pleasing graph, but one thing to keep in mind is they do have one key message, and there's a lot of data that isn't necessarily related to that, but also part of it. So in terms of just the comment on the color, this was based on their color palette for the inner report. I wouldn't necessarily have chosen this color, and I would be cautious about choosing any yellow or gray because it does not show up very well when projected. But this was purely made for print or for electronic distribution. I don't think they printed it. So it's something to keep in mind and why the yellow and gray might have been chosen. So in terms of understanding your audience, so one activity you can do is to develop personas. So as I mentioned, I'm a PhD student in human-centered design and engineering. And the concept of usability research is more so used when trying to market products and test different websites and such. But one thing I found very interesting of how UX individuals think about usability is defined as absence of frustration, which I think is really nice and captures, you know, what you don't want people to experience when they see a data visualization. Because to be honest, I don't know if you've been in a meeting where someone will raise their hand and say, I don't really understand what's going on. So you want to be able to think about how you can minimize any frustration when someone is engaging with their data visualization. One technique that you can use that we have suggested is developing personas. For the personas represent people that you're trying to, that you want are your key audiences when you're trying to get your communication goals. So here's an example, and we've used this example, and it'll be part of the UNICEF technical note on visualizing nutrition data, where we have hypothesized an individual who is a maybe mid-level individual who works for the Ministry of Health. And the things that I want to highlight for you when developing this persona, things that we wanted to bring out is what technology do we expect them to engage with this data, and why we brought this out. And it's generally not something that's part of what the traditional usability personas that I've seen is. We have seen that decision makers generally have a better smartphone than a laptop, or more reliable smartphone than a laptop. And so it's something we think about when we, you know, are creating visualizations that we want them to share over WhatsApp or things like that. And then also like dissemination preferences. So we've worked with decision makers who the expectation is they want a print handout no matter what. So yes, there can be an electronic handout that can be shared over email easily, but also when we're doing a dissemination event, an expectation is that there is some type of printed brief that they can take back to their office. So thinking about how we would accommodate both electronic and print distribution. And then also we've outlined in the top right, we have some squares that we've plotted out to think about, you know, how reliable is their internet connectivity? If you think about some policymakers within LMICs, they are paying out of pocket for their internet access. And so thinking about how much do we want to create, for example, a really big PowerPoint presentation that they would need to download, or some type of interactive data visualization platform. Familiarity with nutrition data is something that we wanted to pull out because, again, there are some career politicians that may have less familiarity with agriculture, nutrition, health data. And that's something that we kind of pull out even more in the center of relationship with nutrition data. And so we've picked out some different aspects of familiarity with different types of data sources, how coverage measurement is collected for certain indicators, and also their own preferences of different data. In terms of other additional considerations we want to include in this particular example, we mentioned that, you know, this individual, hypothetical individual, is working for a minister who doesn't have a lot of time. And so thinking about how can we whittle down the data visualizations to a point where we can create a story that doesn't involve a lot of time to make sense of that story. And also thinking about individuals that are colorblind. There are no global estimates on color blindness, and something that came out from our Tanzania study was individuals that we interviewed talking about themselves being colorblind or their colleagues being colorblind. It's not something that we had really considered within our own personal work. And it's also something to keep in mind, because even within the Tanzania context, most of the dissemination materials that we created were beholden to the government color palette. And so thinking about what other visual cues we could incorporate while staying within that color palette was something that we wanted to think about. So our next exercise that I'm going to ask you to do, and you can do this individually, is what are characteristics of a hypothetical audience you want to reach? And so we're going to take maybe 5 minutes, and I would love if you could just think about what types of characteristics you would want to consider when developing your data visualization. So I'm just going to keep this slide on the screen just for your reference. And so kind of like take the next 5 minutes to jot down what are things you want to keep in mind, and what are things that you want others to keep in mind as the participants when considering how you would approach developing a persona based on your target audience. So I'm going to pause now, and then I'll ask if there are other individuals that are very brave and would like to share. I really love seeing some of all of these recommendations of things to keep in mind, because a lot of them are things that aren't necessarily captured from individuals who do data visualization work outside of this agriculture, nutrition, health space on decision making. So some of what people have brought out is like the emotional response. Honestly, there are, just like American politics here, there is some issues that resonate more with certain politicians. And so thinking about, how do you get someone to care about something that might not be within the realm of their priorities, or maybe try to convince them or link it to something that they really keep in mind. And so one example from the Tanzania work with this study is, as I already had mentioned to you, everyone only wanted to see bar graphs, but the takeaway wasn't necessarily that all of our graphs had to be bar graphs when we came to the final dissemination. The takeaway was really, if we incorporate other types of data visualizations, the people who are giving the presentation need to be confident enough to be able to explain how to interpret those graphs. Another motivation of not just using bar graphs, even though that's what people are asking for, is on a global level, especially with big visualizations of data that's led by design firms that are outside of this space. They choose more avant-garde or weird data visualizations that aren't necessarily used as often. And so with the Tanzania case, we did include an example of a dot plot. It's called a Lollipop Plot. And the individual who presented this plot, very, very carefully walked people through how to interpret it. And actually it was that one graph out of probably like 30 or 40 graphs that the lead, so it was the head of P.O. Rauch, which is in the US, it would be equivalent kind of like the head of the governors. That was the one graph out of the many, many graphs in the dissemination presentation that he was focused on. And part of it was an emotional component in that it was related to health workforce, and his wife is a nurse, and so it's something that resonated with him. But thinking about this emotional component is very interesting. And also one thing that I want to highlight is there are certain, for example, using icons. There are certain icons that might not be as appropriate to the audience that you're working with or you want to disseminate your work to. I've seen people use baby strollers, for example, in visualizing different estimates, using icons of baby strollers to represent, child health within, places that don't use baby strollers. So thinking about the cultural aspects is important as well. So this is the meat of the presentation, and bear with me, it's a little didactic, but please interrupt me if you have any questions. And this is where we're going to go a deeper dive in what types of graph would you use based on these communication goals or key messages that you've identified. So I'm sure all of you are familiar with a regular bar graph. And when I've discussed this with individuals, or when they first start learning about data visualization, as a child, you think about bar graphs or pie charts and line graphs, and you think really loosely about, well, this is when you would use them. But I'd like to flip that and think about what key messages you want to communicate, and then think about what types of graphs are more appropriate. So in terms of a bar graph, the height of the bars are proportional to the number of events. They're frequently used, for comparison of two or more numbers, but they might not necessarily be the most effective option. So in this presentation, when you see a brain icon, it's because there is some type of data visualization research that suggests something about that type of graph. So in this case, some studies suggest that column graphs or bar graphs are most effective for two categories. And so once you have more categories, people's brains kind of go into overload, or we call it information overload. And so they start losing the ability to interpret many graphs or many different bars. And so here, one type of alternative is a slope graph, and it's useful for comparing the performance of two different categories and how some categories may have changed faster than others. And why this is a pretty good strategy, especially if you have two different categories, is our brains are kind of in tune with thinking about slope, in the sense of when you first show any type of graph, most of the responses will be if things are increasing or decreasing. So here is an example. The left is minimum dietary diversity among children 6 to 23 months in Nigeria as a bar graph. This is the same data set from the DHS. And so on the left side, you have a regular bar graph. On the right side is what it would look like if it was a slope graph. Again, it's the same data, but one thinking is if your key message is really on this change in time between these two surveys, a slope graph is a potential alternative option because it highlights this decrease or increase of slope. Dot plots are another option of showing the estimates of different categories. Dot plots are also known as equiplots by University of Pelotas, that works with the Countdown team. And so dot plots are being used more commonly. I feel like you'll see them more commonly even in UNICEF WHO material, because it's good at emphasizing gaps between numbers. And that's the whole premise of calling them equiplots, to emphasize equity. And why they would be a more effective strategy is because our brains are very good at looking at things at the same plane. So we're looking left to right, up and down. And so there's a common axis where that one axis represents that survey. And then each dot represents a certain, dimension of that survey. And then in this case, in the top right, it's wealth quintile. So each dot represents a different wealth quintile. Again, it's easier for our brains to interpret because everything's on a common axis rather than if the alternative would be a bar chart. And so having to compare height of different planes is a bit more challenging and difficult to process. Here's an example of the JME using a version of a dot plot. And so there are dots at the very top and then a regular bar graph as the second option within each geographic region. So the key message of this graph that they're trying to convey is regional averages can mask variation in country prevalence. And so they're getting to this aspect of equity. So the black bar represents the actual, regional average, whereas the dots represent the individual countries within those regions. And so they are using this, and they don't have a line that goes through the dots, but the premise is the use of dot plots to show this inequity and the wide variation between certain countries. A dumbbell plot, which you've seen from the first examples, is a type of dot plot. It's called a dumbbell plot because there are two dots, and it's like the exercise weight. In this case, what I thought was very unique, and this is from the JME as well, is not only is it a dumbbell plot, but there is arrows that show the direction of change. And so that's a bit more unique than I've seen in other types of dumbbell plots. Again, the key message is the levels of overweight have changed over every region. So it actually, the key message doesn't necessarily have to do with this gap, but they use a dumbbell plot to visualize this key message. And then this is a lollipop plot. I mentioned this briefly as part of the example of what we used in Tanzania to disseminate our materials. Lollipop plot, again, these are all alternatives to traditional bar graphs. Each subnational region, in this case, is represented by a line, and the point estimate is represented by a dot. So the premise is thinking about our looking at planes at left to right, up and down. We're seeing variability of the dots, and then can think about, you know, what type of subnational variability exists in stunting in this case. Back-to-back bar charts are another option to a traditional bar chart, and the most popular example of this is a population pyramid. And why this is a important, useful way of communicating this comparison is because, especially with distribution, is because our brains are tuned to think of symmetry. The traditional criteria for thinking about a fashion model is to look at their face and think about the symmetry of their face. And it's because our brains kind of compare between left and right. And so here is an example of minimum meal frequency in Nigeria among children 6 to 23 months, but kind of reimagined in a back-to-back bar chart. The purpose of this back-to-back bar chart is to think about this distribution. And so thinking very quickly and seeing this example, if we wanted to compare minimum meal frequency between males and females, we can kind of see both visually in the length of the bar and also the point estimates is that they're quite similar. So there's less of a distinction. This strategy is kind of even more useful when there are huge variabilities between the two categories that are chosen, where you can really see the asymmetry. Finally, with maps, maps tend to be obviously very useful for visualizing geographic data. One thing to keep in mind is the geographic area can be misleading, particularly if you have regions that take up more space on the page. And so individuals can are more fixated on thinking about that big space or big chunk of color, even though it might detract from your key message. But one interesting thing that we have found with the use of maps, some individuals, it's very polarized on when seeing subnational data. They either want it visualized as a bar graph or they want it visualized as a map. Some of the distinctions and what you would choose is based on what, again, your communication goals are. When we have worked with individuals who are subnational policymakers, decision makers, they might be keen on comparing how their neighboring regions are doing. And so they might be a governor in a certain state and they want to see how their neighboring states are doing. And in that case, using a map is kind of an easier way to visualize this rather than using an alphabetical list of, a bar graph, because individuals want to see how those neighboring states are doing rather than having to look up each individual state's name to see how they're doing. So there's different, advantages of using a map versus just a normal bar graph. But that was an interesting thing that has come out in our work on what would be the difference. I think I'm going to answer some of these questions that are coming in before we do the next example. I have found maps confusing in understanding distributions. Yes. So one thing to keep in mind when choosing a map is you're not really focusing so much. So it's very difficult to highlight the distribution because, again, it's beholden to the geographic space that region takes up on the image. So that's why it can be quite misleading and why some individuals advocate for not using maps. However, some decision makers, and again, this goes back to determining your audience and thinking about your user personas, is what would be a priority. If you're working with individuals that really want to see how are very competitive and want to see the neighboring region's performance, using a map may be a more appropriate strategy. Also thinking in terms of the shaming involved, some decision makers that we work with really love using shaming to motivate maybe subnational regions that are not doing as well to really improve their performance. And so in that case, they may request perhaps a bar graph, or you can advocate for a different type of graph where the losers, so the subnational units that might not be doing so well in a certain indicator, are at the bottom of a graph, and the winners, quote, are at the top. And so you really want to think about, you know, what you want, again, what you want to communicate and what the audience wants to see. There are a couple questions about software. All of these graphs that are in this presentation are made with Tableau Public, which is free. I have intentionally done this because since I mostly work with individuals that have variable access to different technology, I prefer using technology that is free. Tableau Public is free. You can get a Tableau license. I think actually a full the Tableau Public is essentially has the same functions as Tableau, but you do need to publicly share what you create. And so DataDent, and I've created tutorials on the DataDent website of how to create these graphs on the DataDent website. And so thank you, Riley, for sharing the link. So if you, after the session, if you want to learn how to make these types of graphs in Tableau Public, feel free to access these links and then let me know how it goes. I can also help you. You can also, I've also made these graphs using R. You can also make them using Excel. And again, all of the graphs that I've chosen to highlight today that are part of the training are things that can be made with free software intentionally. And so yes, there are other data visualization options that might be effective, that might require more advanced software, but it's something that I intentionally choose not to focus within the training. 3D pie charts we will get to in the next section, so I'm going to postpone that. So for this exercise, we're going to break out, and what I would like you to think about is based on what we've reviewed, and again, please download the slides, the PDF, because this will help you as reference. I've given you a case study. This is actual data from the World Bank's phone surveys during COVID in 2020, and below is data. And so this is respondents sharing their crop sales compared to pre-COVID and post-COVID. And so the scenario is the NSO, which is the Statistical Office in Malawi, has asked you to put together a slide that conveys the key message of half of respondents report a drop in COVID. So we're going to go into breakout sessions, and I'd like you to discuss what type of graph you would choose. You don't necessarily have to draw it out or actually create the graph. The most important process is discussing with your colleagues what types of graph you would choose. And again, there isn't necessarily a wrong issue, but what's helpful is to have the discussion of why you would choose what. So I'm going to pause here, and then you're going to be put into breakout rooms. And if you have any questions, feel free to send me a chat. Riley also will be circulating, so please feel free to ask her any questions too. So I think we're going to take probably like maybe like 10 minutes to do this. Is the first exercise.
Great, thanks, Trisha. Everyone's going to be automatically sent to their rooms in just a second.
Great. Welcome back. So do any individuals want to share some of the discussion they had in their group? I'm sorry, I don't think we were able to circulate to all of the breakout sessions or breakout rooms, but I'd love to hear what types of discussion you were having on what you would choose and what other factors you wanted to consider when making your decision.
So yeah, our group talked about visualizing this maybe with a pie chart or potentially a compounding bar chart, but basically just whatever we can do to highlight this 50%. So perhaps combining the very bad and not good, and then also combining the good and exceptionally good, so that those are each now one category, just to better visualize the key message and not get too caught up in the weeds. And maybe you could just put this table in an appendix if people had more questions.
Great, thank you so much for sharing. So one thing I want to highlight about their discussion is the idea of collating some of these estimates. It's always a balance between information overload and creating something that highlights your key message. So in this case, the key message focuses on half of respondents. So you don't necessarily need to visualize each of these estimates. Collating some of the estimates might help improve some of the quick take of visualizing. So I said this in one of the breakout rooms just now, is Edward Tufte is a very famous American data visualization researcher, and I have a lot of grief with him. I don't necessarily believe in a lot of things that he's proposed. And also, you know, there have been a lot of research studies that have debunked some of the preferences that he advocates for. One thing Edward Tufte says is never underestimate your audience. I think it's equally dangerous to overestimate your audience and to provide too much information that might create a break point, what I would call a break point of someone losing interest or creating that frustration that we want to avoid, that the usability folks talk about. So if you do want to it is a potential to visualize each of these estimates, but also think about, well, I could actually collate some of these categories. And so to not have individuals think about and do the mental math of adding some of those things. And again, it's erring on the side of never overestimating your audience and creating a visual that passes a first glance take. So think about, you know, if a visual is flashed on a TV screen, would for you know 10 seconds, would someone be able to get away what you want? And so yes, there's a potential where you could visualize all of these 5 estimates separately in a pie chart or a bar graph, but is that actually necessary? In this case, it's not as much of an issue because there aren't that many estimates. But you can imagine, particularly, I'm sure you're familiar with going to presentations where people just show tables. And then I would call this a choose your own adventure, where the audience then has to figure out what you're trying to convey in that table, and they're taking away something that might be very different from what you intend to communicate. Here's another case study. And since in the interest of time, maybe we can take 5 minutes and make this a quick breakout session. But it's a very similar task where you have these estimates and think about how you might want to visualize this.
Before you do that, before we go, could you repost the link to the presentation? It was hard to find in the chat.
Yeah,
Have everybody download it.
we'll do that right now.
So it's in the Zoom chat right now.
Okay, great. I'm going to send everyone to breakout rooms again. Guys, I'm just gonna step away for 1 second. I'll be back in a minute.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm sorry for the short amount of time for this last breakout session, but I'm hoping that you all had at least a start of discussing what types of things you would consider and what types of ways you might want to visualize this data. So does anyone want to volunteer, either share over chat, or you can unmute yourself to share a bit about what your group discussed?
Yeah, I'm happy to share a bit for our group.
Great.
Roughly was, so because there is a lot of data, we're thinking of combining two types of graphs. So maybe like for the wealth, that are the 5 categories, and maybe like do a bar plot, but then kind of above on the side do more either pie chart or dot plot for to compare urban and rural and see the high levels, because especially because for rural and urban, we don't, like, the key message doesn't have to be a specific number, it's just high levels. So if we just show that by, you know, like the size or strong color. But yeah.
Thanks. So one great point that you mentioned is part of the key message is both rural and urban households are experiencing high levels of food insecurity. So the key message in this case doesn't necessarily emphasize the gap. So, you know, you could use potentially a dumbbell plot to show urban and rural, but actually the key message doesn't specify a gap. So a bar chart would be fine. I would recommend not using a pie chart, and we'll get into this in a little bit, because pie charts are used for a key message to compare proportion. And so in this case, we're not really comparing proportion. So it's something to keep in mind. Within the wealth and the different wealth quintiles. So it's funny because some individuals who work in, you know, this nutrition global health data space, when they see wealth, they automatically think about creating a dot plot now or a bar chart. But one thing I want to highlight for you in terms of the estimates. So you see Q1, Q2, Q3, the estimates are around 80%. And then Q4, Q5, the richest quintiles, the percentages are 67-52. So one risk of creating a dot plot or an equiplot is that when you have those dots, they will overlap for Q1, Q2, Q3 because the estimates are very similar. So it really depends on, you know, what you want to show. In that case, like at least an equiplot would show there is a gap in that line between the Q4, Q5 quintiles. So the richest quintiles are experiencing less moderate severe food insecurity. But also think it, you know, if those three wealth quintiles, the poorest wealth quintiles, since those dots will overlap, if someone's really interested in picking out that point estimate, they're not necessarily going to be able to see that very easily if you use an equiplot. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the next category of visualization, which is comparisons, which a lot of you have been eager and already discussing of when you would use a pie chart. As I mentioned, there are some data visualization folks that hate pie charts. It's all very like polarized space of pie chart attitudes. But I think you can use a pie chart very effectively when you don't have that many slices, when there's some variability among the slices, so that they're kind of easier to see. So in the beginning of the presentation, I showed you the global burden of disease pie charts, which are kind of a mess because there are lots and lots of different slices, and they are about the same, you know, width. You would also never use a pie chart for comparison. So a pie chart versus a pie chart. And why that is because, as I mentioned, our brains think about things in terms of planes. And so our brains have a more difficult time comparing pie charts because there are not straight 90-degree angles. And so it's more difficult to compare the different angles, arc length, and wedge proportion. So you would only choose a pie chart when you're sure that the data cannot be effectively visualized by a bar chart or another different way. Just because, you know, for this comparison's sake, and in a lot of cases, you might want to compare different proportions. The pie chart versus the pie chart isn't necessarily the best option. Other things I want to bring up about, you know, kind of strange pie chart variants. So that would include a donut chart, an exploding 3D pie chart, or just a 3D pie chart. I would advocate against never using any of those. So, you know, a donut chart, a 3D pie chart, or exploding 3D pie chart. And the reason is you're adding another level of being able to interpret that type of graph, and including kind of an additional visual element that's not necessary for the interpretation. With a donut plot, something to keep in mind when you think about interpreting a pie chart in general is your brain is going to fixate on the center axis to determine the wedge amount, wedge proportion. So with a donut plot in particular, that's even harder than just a pie chart because you're missing the center axis. So it's more difficult to even see that wedge proportion because it's a gap within that hole. So here's an example of an alternative. It's a stacked bar chart. So again, our brains are thinking in planes, so looking up and down, left and right. And so someone brought this up as a comment of when we did our first exercise. If we're looking up and down, we can kind of see this proportion of colors and compare across these different visual categories, where we see some of, the orange variability and the red variability quite easily. I wouldn't necessarily choose this color scheme. This is from the FAO's SDG report from 2020. And one reason I wouldn't choose this color scheme is because of color blindness, and the distinction between the two color categories aren't necessarily great, but just a comment on this graph. This is a different type of stacked bar chart, which is 100% stacked bar chart. This would be the alternative of doing pie chart comparison. So you can imagine it would be quite a mess if you had a pie chart for each of these regional categories. And so in this way, we can look up and down and see, in terms of the red and the blue, the difference in proportion that goes across the regions. This is another example of visualizing proportion. But in this case, we have two different categories. And apologies, this is not related. This example doesn't include, agriculture or nutrition or health, but this is the only example I saw of a proportion plot. It's called a proportion plot, where there are two different categories. And what you see is you can kind of compare blocks of colors between the left category and the right category. So the link will give you a tutorial on how to create this proportion plot. One advantage of this proportion plot also is if you are creating a data visualization for projector quality, especially, there are huge blocks of color. And so there is an added advantage of that showing up, even if you might not be sure what quality of projector you might have. This is an example, and I wanted to showcase of quick changes. So I do a lot of, I provide a lot of help to individuals that have created dashboards or different data visualization products. And one thing I like to focus on are quick wins, because these processes of creating these data visualization products can be a quite political process. In this case, these are the JHU COVID dashboards that they created per county in the US. And so they launched this after they created the main map of COVID cases that was frequently used. And so one thing that I wanted them to think about is how you could quickly how you would prioritize quick wins and think about what type of information you want to include on this one-page sheet. So for example, something I want to highlight, the middle two graphs. So in the left graph, the original was just a regular bar graph. The middle graph is a pie chart. One change in terms of the middle graph in particular is to think about how much space that pie chart takes on this page and what types of other indicators you might be able to include instead of just that one pie chart, particularly since the population demographics have less, is just one dimension of the socioeconomic potential environment within this county. And another quick win that I want to highlight of this example is the color changes. As I mentioned, this is kind of a political process and being able to negotiate what colors, what branding is used. So on the left are the colors that they had decided would be part of the branding palette of this. And one thing I brought up is the color contrast is quite poor. So one thing I encourage them to do is think about, try and incorporate other color variabilities to at least change the visibility. Okay, so we have another breakout session, and similar to before, I've given you some data and then I've given you a key message. So one thing I want you to think about within groups is how you would visualize this data. Again, if you need help on being able to download the slides, I can add the slides again. But otherwise, why don't we break out into rooms and then maybe give like 10 minutes. Welcome back, everyone. So does anyone want to share what their group discussed?
I'll go for it. Can you hear me?
Yep.
So our group talked about potentially using the stacked bar chart like we saw on 41. So having the different months going down the Y, and then maybe grouping some of the categories of prevalence together and then having it color coded so that you could see the change in the trends.
Great. So another thing that, it's funny because I'm going to pat myself on the back for this one, for this unintentional move that I did. But when I included these case studies, although I included them purposely after certain sections, what I wanted to hear and what I was hoping that you would get out of group discussion is kind of discuss holistically how you would approach doing this, even based on your own familiarity of why you would use certain types of graphs. And so yes, I included this case study after a whole didactic portion about proportion, but then also thinking about this key message, one thing that it flags is proportion over time, but then also it focuses on all of the time actually as one category. And so one thing that, when I have mentioned is when you include a table in a presentation, your audience is on a choose your own adventure because you don't know what necessarily they will get out of it. And so this is a lot of data, for example, that I have given you. And so thinking about how you might even collate certain sections or certain data to be able to support that key message of even just focusing on all of the time column, and then the none of the time column is something to think about. And then also thinking about, how you would visualize trends over time, which is our final category that I'm going to talk about. And really, there's not much to discussing how you would visualize change over time. Either, line graph is essentially what you should always use. Potentially, if you only have 2 time points, a slope graph could be an option. One thing I see a lot is using bar charts to show trends over time, which isn't necessarily something you would need to do when you can just use a line graph. However, I would also think about using a line graph and what would mean when, for example, it shows up on a projector screen, because as I mentioned, big blocks of color end up showing up better. So here are just examples of a regular line graph and a slope graph. Another potential is being able to include both proportion and trends over time. And so these are different area charts. This final section is on one number that is very important, which sounds very silly, but if you want an individual to remember a specific number, it's helpful to have it in a big font or in a certain color. And one thing is that just our minds are attuned at noticing certain numbers that are bigger in a bigger font or noticing a different color. And so this is just an easy strategy if you're thinking about wanting someone to see a certain number that sticks out. You can also visualize a certain numbers or individual estimates visually. So this is the use of icons. This is not a agriculture, nutrition, or health example, but this visualizes COVID deaths in 1 weekend in Northern Italy. And so it has an interesting impact of both an emotional response and using simplistically icons to show this type of data. In the interest of time, I'm just going to show you, I'll describe this example and then feel free to share any thoughts over Zoom chat. But here's another example I gave of different data. It includes a time period. The key messages between August and September of 2020, access to prenatal and postnatal care improves with larger gains in urban compared to rural areas. So feel free, for the next couple of minutes, feel free to share in the Zoom chat or feel free to unmute yourself on how you might want to visualize this type of data. So some certain things that I want to point out to you when seeing this data and the key message. Look at the estimates. They're all about 90-some%. All right, they're pretty overlapping. And so when you see, like, for example, urban, rural, wealth quintile, you might think, oh, should this be an equiplot? Should this be a dot plot? Should this be a, some type of, dumbbell plot? And so the difference is, well, the key message specifies the change over time. So it's something you want to incorporate in the type of graph, but also thinking if you're using a dot plot, the estimates are quite similar. And so you'll have dots that are overlapping. So it's something to keep in mind if you do choose a dot plot option. Basically, if the key message emphasizes change over time, one thing you might want to consider is always thinking about how you might want to use a line graph or such. But again, you could also use a bar chart. The estimate, since the data is quite minimal, it's not, it's sort of like the world is you have many different options. So again, you want to think about your key message, what data you have in terms of how do you actually emphasize and create something that resonates with what your communication goals are. So this final category is a whole group of tips I have for you that are other things that I want to keep in mind. Visualizing uncertainty is something that comes up and people ask me a lot. The academics are generally more inclined to always visualize uncertainty. One thing that I want you to consider is it necessary to visualize uncertainty or to communicate statistical significance? Yes, in terms of transparency, it might be important, but to be honest, many individuals don't understand how to interpret a confidence interval or statistical significance. So if you do include it, and you should always include it if it is dependent on your communication goals, you need to include some type of annotation to help explain in layman terms how to interpret what's going on. So here are some examples of text. There's a statistically high chance the actual number falls within this range. Statistically, this did not happen by chance. And so in this example, there is a study done comparing different ways of visualizing uncertainty. And the option that individuals understood the most was this faded region that's circled in a box. And so it's something to think about is it necessary to visualize statistical significance? One example of this from our work in NEP was when the DHS was conducted in 2015 in Tanzania, it suggested that maternal mortality had increased just based on the point estimates. But really, the confidence intervals were overlapping. So really, the message could have been there was no change, which is also not a great message if you're a politician, but also it's a very different message than getting, oh, our maternal mortality increased after investing so much money. So in that case, that's why we thought it was important to visualize confidence intervals and also to have to make sure that individuals understood why we visualize the confidence intervals and how that influenced interpretation. Here's an example of the New York Times' approach towards to helping readers of the New York Times understand COVID models early in the pandemic. So each different color is a different COVID model that was used. And there's some type of like cheeky irony in that the IHME model confidence interval extends to the body of the text. And so that's kind of to show, you know, how much uncertainty there was involved in these models, particularly for individuals or the population that wanted the truth, particularly like early in the pandemic. I think human nature is would want to know what to expect. And so in reality, there was a lot of uncertainty around the COVID models that were happening. And so the New York Times wanted to convey how much uncertainty actually is involved in these models. Another aspect I want to highlight is color. Again, there are many people who are colorblind and you don't necessarily know who is colorblind in your audience. And so you want to ensure that your color palette is colorblind friendly. You can look up color palettes that are colorblind friendly online, but also there are situations where you need to work within an organization, institution, or government color palette. And so one strategy you can think about is incorporating patterns to help individuals that might be colorblind see some contrast. Scorecards are very popular to use in terms of a data visualization accountability tool, but they also rely on a red, yellow, green color scheme. And so even though individuals do look towards scorecards as sort of a very easy way for individuals to interpret data, another thing to keep in mind is using a traffic light, red, yellow, green color palette might not be very helpful for individuals that are colorblind. Another comment I want to make on color, again, is you want to choose colors that are appropriate to the dissemination product. So if you do intend to project a presentation, you want to ensure that you have colors in enough acuity so that it will show up on a presentation. You might have noticed that I didn't include any scatter plots in this entire presentation. And scatter plots are, I would consider, very academic option of visualizing data. But one thing I have noticed in my experience is scatter plots in particular don't show up very well when doing a presentation. And so that's why you might want to think about using bigger blocks of color, even if an individual insists on using a scatter plot. This is another note to make sure you have accurate axes. Sometimes when you're using Excel or some type of other platform, it automatically spaces your axis when it might be inaccurate. Another thing that I wanted to highlight for you is to make sure that your graphs are resized appropriately. Sometimes they get squished if you don't resize and retain the dimensions of your graph. And so that could make it more difficult to interpret. And then finally, I just wanted some other tips is don't interpret it, as I mentioned, don't overestimate your audience. Having annotations is really helpful to be able to ensure that someone can interpret what you're trying to convey. So this is an example of the JME dashboard. There are annotations that show how you interact with the dashboard. And this is super key, especially when trying to avoid a dead dashboard. So I would call a dead dashboard something that individuals have a lot of inspiration and enthusiasm on creating, but it's not necessarily used. And some of it is not thinking through the breakpoints of people's usability. So maybe someone doesn't even know what to click on or doesn't know how to interpret a graph. So including these annotations can be really helpful. This is an example of how the New York Times includes annotations, where when you scroll, and this is a dumbbell plot, these annotations pop up to show how you interpret this type of graph. And finally, you have an ethical obligation to visualize data accurately. I don't believe that data is as objective as you think it is, because people tend to cherry pick something to support their case. This is two examples of Donald Trump fixating on the case fatality rate early in the pandemic, for example, to show that COVID was not as bad as it was. And then also Sharpie Gate, when he manipulated physically where this hurricane would go. And if you're interested in these examples, there's a whole book called How Charts Lie that shows all the examples of data visualization gone wrong. And then finally, we have, as I mentioned, we have Tableau public tutorials on the DataDent website. You can access them through this link. Riley shared it earlier also in the presentation. So feel free to look through them and then shoot me any questions you have over email on if you need help being able to make some of the graphs. And there's some additional reading. So we have 5 minutes left, which is great. Why don't we focus on doing a Zoom poll on one of these? So maybe on the one on the right. So again, this is the example that we shared at the beginning of the presentation. So we'll pop up a Zoom poll and then feel free to share if you would choose option 1 or option 2. And this is for the example on the right. Okay, it looks like more people have chosen the option on the left. So that's the dumbbell plot. So in this case, so I mentioned that there's no wrong or right answer, but if I was visualizing this key message, I would choose the option on the left, primarily because the key message emphasizes a gap. And so what I want to show is the length of the line changing for all of these different categories. And that's why I would choose the option on the left. The option on the right, a traditional bar graph, it's fine, but one thing to keep in mind is, as I mentioned, our brains are comparing or have an easier time thinking about things in the same plane. So one advantage of the dumbbell plot is that the dots are on the same plane and our brains can look left or right. And it's a lot of bars of varying length. And so there would be another additional hurdle of being able to think about how those bars vary and how those estimates vary. So I'm going to stop here. There's 3 minutes left. And so I feel free to ask any questions and I'd be happy also to answer any questions over email as well. My email address is in the presentation.
Yeah, thanks very much. This was really helpful. So why do people, when they're using pie charts, do those rotated ones that try to make them look like 3D? Because it's so much harder then to read the proportions.
That is a great question. I think people think they look fancier. So when I first got started in data visualization research, One thing people, one like little mini study that was done in Kenya, where they showed different examples of visualization, and people always chose the fanciest looking visualization that looked I guess the most sophisticated. However, when the follow-up question was, what does this mean? People couldn't necessarily interpret it. And so it was the thinking of, well, exploding pie chart or a 3D pie chart must be, a cooler, more snazzy version. But honestly, the 3D aspects don't add to the interpretation. I would argue kind of detract from the interpretation, like you said. So that's why I would never use a 3D pie chart or exploding pie chart. I think one issue is that the 3D pie chart is an option in Excel. So people have that creative reign to do that. But it's a good point to bring up.
Thank you. That point about what people chose as the fanciest, that's important to keep in mind. Yeah, thanks. And great presentation.
Thanks. Yeah, it's as I mentioned, I really strongly believe that the data visualization is only as good as the audience finds it. So if someone can't interpret your 3D pie chart, then you've kind of lost your purpose. Naomi, I think you have your hand raised.
Hi, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thank you. It was a great presentation. I think I just have a question about, like when people want to show distribution, so either like statistics, something like that. So do you think that should be only when, for example, writing a paper for the scientific audience, but other than that, it's basically better to use more interactive representation that maybe don't show all the stats, but that make the point?
Yeah, can you clarify what you mean by distribution?
Like, for example, the box plot or something like that, so just to see, these kind of things.
I see. Oh, so like statistical significance. So one thing I would keep in mind is, so one thing that came up when we did the Tanzania study, and one policymaker said this, and it'll always stick with me. We tested statistical significance and confidence intervals as part of the study because it was part of understanding maternal mortality and the increase point estimate. And one policymaker said, why are you showing me a confidence interval? It's like pouring water through a sack. And the point of that was, he was trying to convey that many of his peers and himself also cannot interpret it. So unless there is clear guidance on why you need it, or if it really does have to do with interpretation, then it might be better to omit. And again, it's this balance of information overload. Yes, you want to be transparent, but also what if you open more confusion? In terms of these strategies that were tested, the shaded region option I've noticed has been used very widely now in global health. I noticed that UNICEF uses this strategy primarily. But again, it does depend. And I feel like visualizing confidence intervals or this distribution, it really depends on who your audience is.
Thank you so much, Trisha. Thank you everyone so much for joining. We're going to wrap up this session now, but I just want to thank Trisha and Riley and the DataDent team, and also everyone for your questions and participation throughout the session. So as I mentioned in the beginning, this session is being recorded. So the recording will be put on the website in the coming week or two. And please also visit the ANH Academy website for all of the research conference activities happening next week. All the information and program is on our website. So thank you again so much for joining this lab, and I hope everyone has a good rest of your day.